Hey, welcome to Armageddon Talk Radio. My name is Jacob Michael King, and this week I'd like to discuss freedom of worship. I'm trying to determine the best way to have a discussion about freedom in America, what we understand by freedom, what it means to us, and how that meaning might have changed. And I thought the best way to do that is to examine these four freedoms paintings by Norman Rockwell. They were commissioned in 1943. They appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. The four freedoms: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And then the freedom of religion painting was actually called freedom of worship. These four were based on four freedoms enumerated by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his 1941 State of the Union address, which occurred right before he brought us into the Second World War. So Rockwell, in the heat of battle now, a couple years later, is recalling the State of the Union address and trying to remind Americans, I think, of what it is we're fighting for. So let's talk about freedom of religion. Freedom of religion is so incredibly important. I mean, it's considered to be one of really our fundamental rights. And it's as American as apple pie, but what does freedom of religion really mean? I would argue that this meaning has become tribalized. Americans of a more liberal political persuasion believe one thing about freedom of religion, while Americans of a more conservative one believe another. And so it's basically, I think there's a question of whether or not the state should protect us from religion, or whether the state should protect religion from others, right? Or from secularism or from the state itself. However, there's a basic dogma to which both sides at least seem to agree. I want to show two examples of this from almost 80 years apart. The first one is Will Durant's essay, Freedom of Religion, in the Saturday Evening Post. The second example I want to show is a YouTube video. It's a little cartoon that's like 3 minutes long, and it addresses the same issue, and it comes to essentially the same conclusion. But the way it comes to it is very different. Despite their thematic similarity, the essay and the video, I think there's a very important and very unusual implication in the essay that it's sort of quietly stated in the essay, but it's very explicitly made in the video. What I'm talking about is this assumption that religion is subjective. It comes down to personal preference. And historically, that's certainly not how religion has been understood. The people who followed religious beliefs until a few centuries ago would find this notion totally alien. Let's start with Will Durant's essay. If you're wondering who Will Durant is, he was a famous sort of popular philosopher type. He was a historian, he was a public intellectual back in the day. If he lived in our era, he'd probably be on Bill Maher or CNN, and he might make an appearance or two on, say, Joe Rogan or Sam Harris's podcasts. The essay starts like this. Down in the valley below the hill where I spend my summers is a little white church whose steeple has been my guiding goal in many a pleasant walk. So I can't say whether the readers of his time were on the whole moved by this essay. Maybe a lot of them were. They might have been shell-shocked from the war at this point. It could have been a real salve to their souls. I thought it was pretty corny, and you will too if you read it. I'll put a link in the description. The parishioners in Will Durant's imagined church are pretty unlettered, but he makes this move. He pretends to be humble, but it's very clearly condescension when he continues. This is what he says. Listen to this. These men of the fields, coming from afar in the uncomfortable finery of a Sabbath morn, greeting one another with bluff cordiality, entering to worship their God in their own fashion, I think sometimes that they know more than I shall ever find in all my books. They have no words to tell me what they know, but that is because religion, like music, lives in a world beyond words, or thoughts, or things. They have felt the mystery of consciousness within themselves, and will not say that they are machines. They have seen the growth of the soil and the child. They have stood in awe amid the swelling fields, in the humming and teeming woods, and they have sensed in every cell and atom the same creative power that wells up in their own striving and fulfillment. Their unmoved faces conceal a silent thankfulness for the rich increase of summer, the mortal loveliness of autumn, and the gay resurrection of the spring. So in Durant's worldview, in his understanding of man, this unformed intellect seems to allow the spirit an easier passage into the soul. Because they're so simple, they're distinct from animals. Man, he says, is distinct from animals only in that he laughs and prays. Apparently, though, these people that are almost animals, they hold a sense of tolerance to them as important as the practice of their religion. He writes, "This little church is the first and final symbol of America. For men came across the sea not merely to find new soil for their plows, but to win freedom for their souls, to think and speak and worship as they would. This is the freedom men value most of all. For this they have borne countless persecutions and fought more bravely than for food or gold. These men, coming out of their chapel, what is the finest thing about them, next to their undiscourageable life? It is that they do not demand that others should worship as they do, or even that others should worship at all. In that waving valley are some who have not come to this service. It is not held against them. Mutely, these worshippers understand that faith takes many forms, and that men name with diverse words the hope that in their hearts is one." Okay, so in Will Durant's conception, worship for these folks is an exercise of their dearest and most human capacity, but this gift is so precious that they would not dare force it upon their neighbor. And there would be no need, it seems, to invite their neighbor to church, right? Because after all, faith takes many forms, and men name with diverse words the hope that in their hearts is one, according to him, right? But that's just nonsense, like really. The hope that in their hearts is one, I mean, give me a break. What are all the religious wars then? Wars were fought between members of the same religion, to say nothing of, the Crusades, for example. If we reduce it to a general well-being of mankind or whatever, if this hope that in all of our hearts is one, what we do is we undermine the power of any specific faith tradition. And we actually create a kind of new faith, I think. If the sentiments expressed in this freedom of worship essay sound like those of a man without any particular religious commitment, or rather with a commitment to a lack of religion, that's because Durant himself was a committed skeptic. This is what he wrote elsewhere. He said, "You will not need to be told now that I am a theological skeptic, believing in neither the warlike God of the Hebrews nor the punishing and rewarding God of the Christians. I see many evidences of order in the universe, but also many conditions that seem to be disorderly, as in the reckless whimsies of meteors or the arrogant deviations of planetary orbits from the paths that our geometry would have required." So there's an oversimplification, gross in more ways than one, at work in Durant's treatment of believers. That can't be argued, but it also can't be argued really that despite our considerable religious, ethnic, and political diversity, there was a spirit that unified us against the twin threats of fascism and communism. This spirit led us to victory in the bloodiest conflict the human race has ever seen. And this same spirit established the United States as the dominant power in the world. Perhaps this spirit, like Durant's notion of religion, quote, lives in a world beyond words or thoughts or things. But at the risk of committing the sort of oversimplification I've criticized, it might be the belief that America bears the torch of a unique kind of freedom. That's the way I imagine it. And it seems like Americans for a long time believe that it's our destiny to set the world alight with this freedom. This conquering fire, so to speak, is described by Durant not as an imperialism, but as an altruism, as a missionary zeal. He writes, "When we yield our sons to war, it is in the trust that their sacrifice will bring to us and our allies no inch of alien soil, no selfish monopoly of the world's resources or trade, but only the privilege of winning for all peoples the most precious gifts in the orbit of life, freedom of body and soul, of movement and enterprise, of thought and utterance, of faith and worship, of hope and charity, of a humane fellowship with all men." that, to me, sort of evokes the Gospels a little bit, because Jesus, after rising from the dead in the Gospels, gives this famous order to his disciples. It's been called the Great Commission. He tells them it's their job from now on to go into the world spreading Christianity everywhere. This is how the Gospels say. This is from the Gospel of Matthew. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." So, if you ponder that, I think that you're probably going to see a similarity. Durant appears to assume Americans have a kind of mandate from heaven, not to tell people to observe Christ's commandments, but to win for people the freedom to do as they please, at least within reason, and to believe as they please. There's a great commission in Durant's essay as well, a need to save the world, but not by faith. Rather, to save them from any faith so great that it would compromise our tolerance of others. Like all faiths, this one, the stronger it grows, begins to clash with systems that contradict it. The next piece I'd like to look at is an animated story booth video that's gotten to date about 12 million views. More eyes have likely seen this than ever read Will Durant's essay. The video plays like a kind of trailer for a spiritual Mean Girls. There's all sorts of bullying and bigotry and discrimination at the hands of little inquisitors.
I've always been one of the only Jewish people in my town. I'm not super religious, my parents didn't force their religion on me, but I still believed in it. In elementary school, a lot of kids went to church, and there's nothing wrong with that. Everyone's allowed to have their own religion, but they didn't really see it that way. And a lot of them would overhear their parents, or they'd hear churches talking about how if you didn't worship their religion, you would go to hell. And I don't think anyone realizes that kids learn and they imitate what they see. So, of course, I'd be on the playground or doing whatever, and kids would come up to me and tell me that Jewish people were trying to take over the world and that we were all super greedy money hogs, and that if we didn't worship their religion, we were all going to hell. And I wasn't the only person who faced hate. It was also Muslim kids. A lot of them were told that Muslims were terrorists and that they still probably had contact with people who did 9/11. I used to actually go home and I would cry because I thought I was going to hell if I didn't go to church. Like, I asked my parents to go to a Christian church before I even knew what that meant. That's not the way kids should be introduced to other religions. They should be introduced as religion can be a good thing. It can bring people together. And it was before I even knew what the cross stood for. Like, I used to see people with them all the time and wondered what the T-shaped necklace meant until one of my very, very close friends who went to church explained to me what it was. My parents had just said that some people believe in different things and they have a right to believe. It's like ice cream. If you force your belief down my throat, I'm not going to want it, but some people like different types of ice cream or different types of belief, and that's okay. That doesn't make them a terrible person. But what does is telling other people that they're terrible just because they like a different ice cream flavor than you. You know, I don't hate Christians or Catholics or anyone. I just wish that someone had told these kids not to repeat the things that they heard anti-Semitic or Islamophobic people say. Like, before people even knew what the word Muslim meant, they knew the word terrorist. And before they even knew what the term Jewish meant, they just knew we were bad. I remember back in middle school when they told everyone about the Middle East, they had said Jesus was a Jew, and everyone gasped and was so shocked. To me, it made me realize how stupid everyone was being. Everyone was hating each other just because of religion. In high school, no one really gave me any problems, except for one girl, but I didn't really care at that point. Anyone who judges somebody off of what they think is going to happen after we die isn't worth your time.
I think it's important to notice how our protagonist identifies herself. She says her parents never forced their religion onto her. So she was never that strictly observant. You don't see that in, for example, Hasidic communities, right? Perhaps this is why her parents chose to place her in a community like in a much more diverse community, not only among Jewish children, but among children of all religious persuasions. These other children certainly aren't trained to respect her culture or belief. Maybe these kids, like most kids, would have picked on her for any deviation they spotted. But in her story, these children seem uniquely vicious. They're caricatures as exaggerated as the ones Durant paints, though of the malignant variety. Certainly, though, and I want to make this clear, this is a narrative that isn't out of the realm of possibility. There's a ton of bigotry, anti-Semitic and otherwise, and kids are nasty. So let's just take her at her word. Judaism is a complicated, diverse, and ancient faith. Certainly too rich to explore in any depth in the space of a YouTube video. Suffice it to say, it's impossible to call her attitude inauthentically Jewish. It would be unfair to say that she isn't practicing Judaism right or that she misunderstands it. There are certainly many Jewish people who feel precisely the way she does about the afterlife and approach their faith in a similar fashion. But I would say that this narrator's characterization regarding what's important about faith and the limits of faith in polite society excludes any devout Christian and many devout Muslims as well. Let's take a look at some of the assumptions that she makes about faith and belief. Faith seems to be a matter of subjective personal preference. She compares it to ice cream. Different people like different kinds of ice cream. This seems like it could be close to the idea of freedom of conscience. You can choose to believe what you want, but it's not really at all, because there's no real consequence if I like strawberry or chocolate ice cream or no ice cream at all. If you look at what her close Christian friend says to her, you notice that he mentions atonement. Jesus dies for the sins of everyone, he says in that thought bubble. What is this sin question, right? Like, what is Jesus dying for? Jesus dies because he was sinless, right? And he atones for the sins of mankind. You can believe it or not. But what I'm saying is, this belief, if someone actually holds to that, they can't hold to a belief in religious tolerance primarily. That can't be their central value, because if someone genuinely from the bottom of their heart believes that someone else is going to go to hell if they don't hear this news, then their personal embarrassment, or whether they're going to look like a bigot or whatever, is of far less consequence than the eternal salvation of that person they're talking to. They would be selfish to think, oh, this person's not going to like me, or they're going to think they're discriminating against me or whatever. So I'm asking you to see that from their perspective, from the perspective of some Calvinist kid who thinks, I have to go witness to this person. I have to go missionarize this person, right? So their religion, their primary religious perspective, their metaphysical worldview is grounded in this heaven and hell thing, and thinking, oh my goodness, like I have to help this person. Now, a lot of these kids sound like they were just sort of pricks, right? And that they weren't doing that at all, that they were picking on someone and being a bigot. But imagine that one or two of those friends, right? Maybe her very good friend might have explained this, and the video was too short to describe this, but might have explained why they believe what they do. But if someone comes to another person and is that deeply concerned about the afterlife, which Christianity and Islam are to a greater degree than some forms of Judaism, right? Like Christianity, Paul says we're to be in and not of the world. And, Jesus tells someone to give up everything he has, sell it to the poor, and follow him. That there's this perspective in the New Testament, and certainly in traditional Christianity, that we should count this life as basically nothing compared to what we're going to get in the future, or what we're working toward in the future. That this life is entirely built toward, this life is entirely set, rather, toward building up treasures in heaven. Jesus himself says, don't build your treasures on the earth. They're all corruptible. Build your treasures in heaven. And so this idea that if you're not going to befriend someone based on the fact that they value the future life more than this present one, then there, I think, is another form of religious bigotry. I feel like this video, the theme of this video, whether or not the individual telling the story is holding to this, I think what's being implied by the video is something very similar to what Durant is implying in his essay, which is that the freedom to believe what one wants is more important than any particular belief. That this is what it's our duty to emphasize. This is what it's our duty to fight for. And this is the gospel that we should spread throughout the world. Religion these days seems to boil down to a matter of personal preference. It's your business and nobody else's. You can't impose yours on somebody else, and someone else had better not impose theirs on you. I can understand, certainly, the argument that this is a more enlightened worldview. It's indisputable that when things get too theocratic, life can be pretty nasty. But it's important to understand that this is a fairly new perspective, and one demonstrably at odds with how religion was generally understood for centuries in many cultures, Western and otherwise. Let's take the example of the persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. The motivations behind the persecution were pretty varied, but among the most common was the belief that Christians were a threat to public safety. Why would ordinary Roman citizens want to kill their neighbors, especially over something so trivial as a difference of subjective belief? If I believe in Jupiter and Sally down the street believes in Jesus or the flying spaghetti monster or whatever, is that a good reason to burn her alive? You might counter that persecution was the policy of the Roman government, that the citizens were just following orders. But that can't be right. I mean, yeah, there were empire-wide persecutions of Christians, but they weren't particularly common. A great deal of the persecution was local, and a great deal of that persecution was not government-led. In fact, many Christians died at the hands of mobs. Mobs of regular citizens would slaughter their neighbors. Why on earth would they do that? Typically, a Christian would be given a simple test. If they passed this test, they'd be off the hook. And what was that? They had to perform a sacrifice to one of the gods. They had to swear by the genius of the emperor. Were Romans so very devoted to their deities that the slightest impiety would send them into a frenzy? These Roman citizens clearly didn't see religion as a matter of personal preference. On the contrary, offering the gods the worship they were due was a matter of public safety. And why is that? What is it about worship or religion that, far from being subjective, was a matter that got the entire village involved? Well, it was the gods who preserved this village. It was the village, the city, the nation. It was under the protection of the gods. Any act of impiety or disrespect might cause these divine beings to rescind their protection, and the results could be disastrous. From the perspective of a Roman pagan, the impiety of their Christian neighbors imperiled the whole community. It was a grave threat that required an equally grave response. This assumption that the safety of the community is in divine hands is by no means exclusive to the Romans. Certainly you see it in Jewish scripture and in Christian. During the Black Plague, many Christians asked what sins they'd committed to cause God to inflict what was, no doubt in their minds, a just punishment on the people of Europe. In many cultures, ancient and modern, Western and not, when crops failed or a disease gutted a community, it was thought that witches were to blame. Next time there's a tsunami or an earthquake or a terrorist attack, whatever the next big tragedy is, some televangelist is going to get themselves in trouble by blaming the disaster on sinful behavior. Maybe these remarks are stupid and cruel. They can sure come across that way, though they're often intended in compassion. See, the televangelist subscribes to the belief that the safety of their community is in divine hands, and they're trying to remind people that they have to behave a certain way, otherwise they're going to incur the wrath of their creator. Cicero defines religion as the proper performance of rites in veneration of the gods. This is something we're obligated to do in order to maintain a harmony between the divine and human realms. Without this harmony, an imbalance can occur that can result in great personal or public danger. For those who subscribe to such a view, religion is much deeper than personal preference. Thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts. Subscribe if you want, like if you want, and yeah, leave your thoughts in a comment below. I'd like to talk about it.